Gladiatorial battles were a major entertainment in the Roman Empire for 6 centuries. The bloody battles attracted a huge public, which included rulers, the nobility, ordinary people, and even artists. Today, thanks to numerous and often distorted descriptions, gladiatorial fights have become the most famous and most misinterpreted element of ancient culture. To this day, researchers are still trying to understand who the gladiators were, why they caused such excitement among the public, and how exactly the fights took place in the arena. The fighters who faced each other in mortal combat evoked rather mixed feelings in the audience: admiration, excitement, contempt, and fear. Even women watched with undisguised fascination the outcome of the battle, during which every second could lead to a tragic outcome. Some scholars agree that the story of the gladiators is the most gruesome example of human cruelty and greed. According to Roman historians, the custom originally originated with the Romans' northern neighbors, the Etruscans, as a remnant of funerary sacrifices. When a member of a noble family died, prisoners of war or slaves had to fight each other at the funeral pyre, so that their blood would propitiate the spirits of the underworld. The Campanians borrowed this custom from the Etruscans, and the Romans adopted it from the latter. In Rome, gladiatorial fights were first introduced in 264 BC by the sons of the dead senator Decimus Junius Brutus Pera. In 216 BC, 22 pairs of gladiators fought each other at funeral feasts in honor of Marcus Aemilius Lepidus at the Roman Forum. In 206 BC, Publius Cornelius Scipio had arranged a gladiatorial contest in honor of his dead father and uncle in Carthage, modern Cartagena in Spain. Here not only forced prisoners of war fought each other in the arena, but also volunteers eager to demonstrate their contempt for death and their martial prowess. From 186 BC onward, in addition to gladiatorial combat, Rome also organized pitfalls in which bestiaries armed with slingshot fighters fought against predators. The people liked the unusual spectacle so much that it quickly became a crowd-favorite entertainment. The burial ceremony of the gladiatorial games was not a priority, and the games became a purely entertainment event. The games were organized both by the magistrates in power and by private individuals. Warlords gave them before the start of a campaign to harden their soldiers with the sight of wounds and blood. Politicians did them to win the popularity of their voters. The frequency of the games increased, as did the number of participants. After Gaius Julius Caesar brought out the games in 65 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar brought a record 320 pairs of gladiators into the arena. His opponents passed a law limiting the maximum number of spectators to 120 fighters. To prevent the possibility of bribery of voters, in 63 BC another law was passed that prohibited applicants for public office to organize gladiatorial fights for 2 years prior to their election. The emperors, starting from Augustus, tried to take such a popular show under their control. According to the law, adopted in 22 BC, gladiatorial games had to be organized by officials, first by aediles and then by quaestors. Individuals were obliged to ask the Senate for permission in order to organize such contests. Regular competitions were arranged twice a year, in December and March. The number of participants was limited to 60 pairs. Emperors also organized spectacles, which were usually connected with some significant event, such as the anniversary of their term in power, the opening of a public building, or victories won. Augustus declared in his will that he had staged gladiatorial games on his own behalf 3 times and on behalf of his sons and grandsons 5 more times. These games were attended by up to 10,000 people. He also staged 26 occasions of trampling, during which 3,500 wild animals were killed in the arena. Augustus' successors had tried to outdo him in the scope of the spectacles. In 43 AD on the Champ de Mars, on the occasion of his conquest of Britain, Emperor Claudius exposed the siege and looting of the city. He himself staged that spectacle while wearing the cloak of a military leader. In 52, at the descent of Fucine Lake, he organized a battle of fleets of 12 triremes each, with a total of 19,000 warriors taking part in it. But all his predecessors were surpassed by Emperor Trajan, who staged games to celebrate the conquest of Dacia. The festivities, which lasted from June 107 to November 108 for 117 days, involved 9,883 gladiators and 11,000 wild beasts battling each other in the arena of the Colosseum. By the 4th century, gladiatorial contests were being staged for 10 days a year. The Roman mob was passionate about games and contests. The educated decried their brutal nature, but their voices were barely audible for a long time. It was only with the spread of Christianity that attitudes toward games began to change. In 325, Emperor Constantine promulgated an edict condemning bloody spectacles. His successor, Constantius, in 357, forbade volunteers to join gladiatorial schools. In 399, Emperor Honorius closed the schools altogether, and in 404 he banned the games. Wild animal travesties continued to be staged in Rome until 523, and in Constantinople until 681, when they were finally banned. Citizens learned about the upcoming gladiatorial games well in advance by reading the announcements on the billboard. The poster contained all the information about the future feast: date and time, the occasion of the battles, the number of gladiators, the names of the most popular fighters, the order of the performance. The day before the fight, the gladiators of Rome spent the day feasting. Delicious food was prepared for them, compositions were performed, and graceful girls danced. In the morning, citizens converged to admire the procession of fighters heading into the arena. In front of them walked the lictors proudly, and behind them the trumpeters and retinue. At the very end was a clerk and a man with a palm branch in his hand, which was used to honor the victor. First, wild animals were released into the arena: lions, tigers, bears, etc. The animals were not fed for several days in order to create in them an overwhelming sense of hunger and bitterness. Not surprisingly, from the very first seconds, there was a real fight in the arena. After that, the audience was treated to an animal hunt in which a specially trained warrior stood against the animals. A gladiator wore only a pair of leather strips and a spear instead of armor. The emperors brought all kinds of exotic animals for the games. Sulla brought 100 lions. Julius Caesar brought 400 lions. And Pompey brought 600 lions, 400 leopards, and 20 elephants. Later on, the number of animals only increased. For example, Ulpius Trajan killed about 11,000 different breeds in virtually one fell swoop. Trappers toiled tirelessly, ravaging Roman provinces daily. Thus, wolves, bears, panthers, wild boars, wild bulls, bison, antelope, deer, giraffes, monkeys, and even a polar bear entered the bloody arena. Next, the public was invited to watch the public execution of criminals or convicted Christians. They were thrown into the arena unarmed and given to the furious beasts. Such a death was considered by the Romans to be the greatest disgrace. The lifeless bodies were removed with special hooks, and the bloodstains were covered with clean sand. At the very end of the performance, the main heroes, the gladiators of Rome, appeared before the assembled crowd. At first, they were armed only with wooden swords, warming up before a real battle and preparing the audience for an unforgettable performance. After training, the Lannists introduced the people to the participants of the fights. Gladiatorial fights lasted only 10 to 15 minutes, so as not to bore the spectators. All in all, during the day it was possible to see about 10 fights. They knew about the start of the fight by the distinctive sound of a horn. The defeated, but still alive fighter could lift up 3 fingers, thereby asking for mercy. The fate of the ancient gladiator depended on the disposition of the audience. If the warrior managed to win the support of the audience due to his skill, bravery, and ability to fight, he could hope for a pardon. If not, the warrior had to pass a cruel test, to meet death without taking his eyes off his rival and without losing his dignity. The crowd decided the future of the gladiator through special signs. The thumbs up meant life, and down meant death. The cheers of the crowd were of no small importance. To publicly prove the death of a man, the manager touched some part of his body with a red-hot iron. After the fight, the artist in the guise of Charon, the carrier of the souls of the dead across the river Styx into the underworld kingdom of the dead, and Mercury, god of gymnastics, commerce, profit, intelligence, agility, carried the lifeless body through the door, which led to the corpse room. There the dead gladiator was stripped of his tattered clothes and weapons were taken away. The public was impressed by the Navmaki, reconstructions of naval battles. Even modern scholars are amazed at the scale of such a spectacle. So in 46 BC, the Romans realized that a unique performance awaited them. On the field of Mars, builders dug out an artificial lake of enormous proportions. During the Navomachy, some 16 galleys met in a fierce duel. Over 3,000 rowers propelled the vessels, and 2,000 gladiators spilled their blood. It would seem that mankind could not have a more sensational show, but 44 years later, Octavian Augustus delighted the Romans with a new Navmachy, where they fought 24 ships and 3,000 soldiers. The public was lucky to see with their own eyes the clash between the Greek and Persian fleets at Salamanca. Claudius was able to break the record of previous rulers by organizing a Navmachia on the Lake of Phoenix. In a desperate battle, met already 50 ships and 20,000 people. Only Trajan managed to outdo all Roman emperors, who organized a march of 123 days for the Roman people. For 4 months, 10,000 gladiators of Rome fought ceaselessly, driving the spectators into a frenzy. Gladiators came from a variety of backgrounds. Most of them were prisoners of war or convicted criminals, whose participation in gladiatorial games was a substitute for a death sentence. Some were released into the arena without any training. Others were trained in the gladiatorial trade beforehand. If the condemned survived for 3 years, he could be pardoned. At the beginning of the 2nd century, Hadrian forbade private owners to use slaves as gladiators without a good reason, but this rule was systematically violated. The most valuable gladiators were volunteers, who made up about a quarter of the fighters. These included retired soldiers, deserters, runaway criminals, and simply thrill-seekers. They had to certify their willingness before the magistrates and swear that they could be burned, knit, flogged, and executed with the sword. The legal status of such a volunteer was reduced to that of a slave, whose life and death for a fixed period of service was to be ruled by his employer. Nevertheless, he could redeem himself before the expiration of his contract. If the gladiator survived, he was free again at the end of his term, and of course, could be hired again. Volunteers received a lot of money for their performances. Veterans who had fought many battles and survived were in high demand. Emperor Tiberius once had to pay out 1,000 gold coins for a single performance by such a fighter, a huge sum. Gladiators were kept and trained for their performances in special schools where they led a harsh but healthy life under the supervision of their Hellenistic teachers. The earliest of these institutions is known at Capua. There were at least 4 such schools in Rome during the Empire: the Great School, the Gallic School, the Dacian School, and the Bestiary School, where bestiaries were trained for bestiality. The remains of the Gladiatorial School at Pompeii include a rectangular court of 56x45 where training took place. The courtyard was flanked by a covered colonnade with doors to 71 windowless cells where gladiators lived in 2 by 2. Other rooms were identified as a prison, a large kitchen, an armory, and a workshop. The largest of the Roman schools had its own small amphitheater with seats for 1,200 spectators. The imperial schools were managed by procurators, who managed a whole staff of employees, teachers of fencing and gymnastics, masseurs, doctors, and wardens. In the provinces, the Lannis had to recruit and train their own troop, and then offer their services to the organizers of the games. In search of customers, they could move from place to place, like a wandering circus, giving performances on the way, which invariably brought a good income. After 2 performances, it was possible to recoup all expenses. The weapons and equipment of the gladiators originally reflected the peculiarities of the armament of the Roman opponents. Over time, changes were made to it. Some types of equipment came into vogue, others disappeared over time. One of the earliest varieties of gladiators was the Samnites, who fought with a sword and defended themselves with a large rectangular shield. Their head was covered by a helmet with rooster feathers. Their armor included a bronze breastplate and a wide leather belt, as well as greaves on their left leg and soft straps to protect their right arm. Their traditional opponents were Thracians, who could be recognized by the image of a griffin on their helmet, a round shield, and a curved sword. The Retiarius was a lightly armed fighter without armor, with an uncovered head, fighting with a trident and a net. His opponent was often a heavily armed securus, wearing a blind helmet with small slits for eyes, armed with a large shield and a short sword. In addition, there were heavily armed diplomas and myrmidons, lacevators who tried to catch the enemy with a harness, and velites who threw darts at the enemy. Assidarians fought in chariots, Andavats fought each other in closed helmets, Meridians entertained the public between the morning beast fighting and the afternoon fights, and Supposants were suddenly released against a newly defeated gladiator. Fighting between gladiators took place both in the form of pair fights and in the form of fights of the whole detachments, which involved up to 100 men of infantrymen and horsemen at a time. As a rule, the equipment of the fighters was specially selected differently, as well as the fighting techniques they used. A secutor who fought with heavy weapons had to get close to his opponent to hit him. The retiarius, on the other hand, fought from a distance, trying to cast a net over his opponent and then strike him with his trident. The participants in the duel demonstrated their mastery of their weapons and sought to wear down or wound their adversary as quickly as possible in order to force him to beg for mercy. There are cases when none of the fighters could defeat the opponent and the fight ended in a draw. Fatal outcome of the fight was a relative rarity. Of the 200 gladiators of the 1st century AD known to us, 19 died on the arena, so their chances of survival were about 9 to 1. Even the loser, in the case where he asked the audience for mercy, could keep his life with a 1 in 4 chance. The winner of the duel received a monetary reward from the organizer of the games and, having described a circle on the arena, walked out through the front gate. The body of the deceased was pulled out through another gate by servants in Mercury and Charon masks. During the excavations of the necropolis of Ephesus, 67 remains belonging to gladiators of the local school were found. Almost all of the skeletons indicate that their owners were young men of between 20 and 30 years of age, above average height, physically very strong. Their bones also bear traces of considerable muscular strain, the result of intense physical training. It seems that some of them began to be trained as gladiators at an early age, probably as teenagers between the ages of 12 and 15, since the observed asymmetry in arm length can only develop until the skeletal maturation. The traces of healed wounds, including quite severe ones, indicate good medical care and the qualifications of the doctors at the school. The unusually high level of strontium in the bones indicates that they followed a vegetarian diet of barley porridge and beans. In addition to strengthening the bones, the plant-based diet helped build up a layer of subcutaneous fat, which must have served as additional protection against cuts and superficial wounds. The bulky, slightly molten bodies of gladiators depicted in Roman mosaics are quite true. We know the fate of many gladiators from their epitaphs. For example, Assyrian Flamma took part in 38 fights during 30 years of his life. If from the age of 17, he went out to the arena once in 4 months at the average. In 25 fights he won, in 4 fights he was defeated, but was released for bravery. In 13 more fights he got a draw. Flamma received a wooden sword 4 times as a symbol of liberation, but he continued to fight in the arena and then was a swordsmanship teacher in a gladiatorial school. The first gladiatorial fights were held in the city markets, right in the middle of open areas. In order to allow the noble families and professions to watch the battles in more comfortable conditions, temporary places were built for them on high ground. When the games became known and attracted a large enough crowd, the government thought about building special buildings. The first games in Rome were held at the Forum or Champ de Mars, where wooden stands were hurriedly erected to accommodate the crowds. Around the middle of 1st century BC, especially for gladiatorial contests, they started to build open amphitheaters. In Italy and its provinces, there are 230 known remains of such constructions. One of the oldest was the amphitheater in Pompeii. Built about 80 BC, its ellipse-shaped arena was buried in the ground. Wooden spectator benches led up the slope. The capacity of the amphitheater was estimated at 20,000 people and was designed not only for the city population but also for the influx of people from the surrounding area. In Rome, the first amphitheater of stone and wood was built in 29 BC Stethelius Taurus. During the fire of Rome in 64 it burned down, and in 72 AD Emperor Vespasian began to build a new stone amphitheater on the site where the Golden House of Nero had once been located. Construction lasted 8 years and was completed in 80 AD by Titus. In ancient times, the name Flavius Amphitheater was used for it, but today we know it as the Colosseum. The Colosseum was the largest Roman amphitheater. Its total height was 48.5 meters, and the foundation was 9 meters deep. In terms of plan, the building is an ellipse with an external circumference of 527 meters. The main axes are 188 meters long and 156 meters wide. The length of the arena axes are 86 and 54 meters. Under the arena was a network of passages and rooms, designed to accommodate the animals and gladiators, as well as mechanisms that lifted to the arena decorations of the performances. The Colosseum seated about 50,000 spectators, but this number could be increased 1.5 times due to the standing seats of the upper tiers.